that morning about 11 o'clock, here come a tank, General Patton standing up in a Jeep with the Jeep had a gunner on the back. He was standing up saluting us, and another tank behind him. And that was the greatest day of my life. I was 18 and I knew I was going to get drafted, and I didn't want to be an Army grunt. I wanted to wear one of those cocky Air Force uniforms and sleep in my barracks every night instead of a foxhole, and ride instead of walk. That was my three main reasons. But my real reason was I wanted to go to college, and if you became a pilot, you got college credit because they sent you to advanced education. And so anyway, I went up and volunteered that day. And I went to Kansas City, and I didn't pass the physical because I was too skinny. And the guy said, go home and drink 2 malted milks every day and eat 3 bananas and come back in 2 weeks. And I did, and he said, you're okay now. So that's how I got in. They looked at me and saw I was 6 foot tall, and the tail gunner's position was about 4 feet high, and you had to ride on a bicycle seat for 8 to 10 hours on your knees, and there was just room enough for you to move your arms like this, and they looked at me and said, you just fit perfect in there. And so that's how I ended up being a tail gunner on B-17. We got one of our engines knocked out over Berlin. 5 of our 12 planes were shot down over Berlin. And we just took a hit, and it slowed us up because we were flying on 3 engines. We went, on the way home, we got tacked on to another bomb group because ours was in disarray. And the group we tacked on to led us over another flak gun, knocked out 1 more engine, and then we got to Hamburg, and they had a big flak unit there, and they got our 3rd engine. And so we were trying to get back on 1 engine, and the pilot said, well, we can't make it back to England, and on 1 engine, we're losing altitude. At that time, the North Sea was, if you landed in the North Sea, you had to be rescued in 30 minutes because it was wintertime. And it's so cold, you'd freeze to death immediately. And he said, we'll just turn around and go back to Germany and bail out, and that's what we did. We bailed out, and I was in the tail, and of course, in that B-17, you have to crawl out of the tail. You can't, it's so tight. And when the pilot was going to have us bail out, he called me and said, we can bail out, we're going to bail out when I ring the bell. I said, I had a little place in the back, it was about this big square, that I could jettison and it would open up and I could do a somersault. And I knew I wasn't going to try to somersault out of that little hole or I might get stuck. And so anyway, I said, can you keep it flying until I get up to the waist? And he said, yes. So I took off so fast, I didn't even unplug my oxygen mask. And they said I looked like an anteater when I come crawling out of there because my mask was dragging this hose, and I torn it off the wall. And they were already all lined up. They jettisoned the waist door, and they were all lined up to jump out. And my best buddy was the armored gunner, and he was in charge of jettisoning the door, and he was the first in line. And when the bell rang, I just held onto his hand and bucked the line. And I went right out with him because I knew that the guys would push me out if I froze in the door. And I counted to 10 so fast. And thank God that my hands were so cold when I pulled the ripcord, it slipped off there and I didn't open it up. If I had, I'd probably been hanging on the tail of my parachute. But anyway, the next time I pulled it, it opened. I landed in a great big tall tree in a forest. And my armored buddy armored gunner buddy landed about 100 feet from me. And I got caught in the top of a tree. And I thought, oh my God, how am I going to get down? Well, it went up once, how you go up and down. Went up, and when it came down the second time, the limb broke. And I fell on something on my back and knocked the wind out of me. And by the time I got up, my buddy was gone. So I got up and took off running and through the woods. Finally found a railroad track, and I started following the railroad track because when my chute opened, I'd lost my K ration and my maps. We had maps and money, escape money. We had an escape kit, they called it. We had German money and German maps and everything, so we could find our way back. Well, I lost all that. When I had it in my flying suit pocket, and when my chute opened, it came out. The first 2 days, I followed this railroad track, and then all I had was a candy bar because I every time I'd get close to a house, if a dog barked, it'd scare me to death, At that time, I was 19. And, you're 19, you're in a strange country, and you don't know what's going to happen to you. And I just figured if they caught me, they were going to execute me, And so I tried to get away. And the third day, that night, I stepped in a woods outside of an area where they were having slave laborers harvest the limbs off the trees. They don't cut the trees down, they harvest all the limbs. And so anyway, I decided that the next morning I saw which way the people went that was working there. I was going to go give myself up. And so at daybreak, I started walking toward this little village. And I met this boy and girl, and they were Russian slave laborers. And they had the caps had a red star on it and everything. That sounded, all they could say was Stalin, boom, boom, and Berlin that I could understand. And the guy pointed to this town that I was walking to, and he went like this, which told me that if I went into that town, they were going to kill me. Finally, he pointed in the opposite direction, pumped his legs up and down like this, and I got the message that I better get out of there. And so I took off running, got back following the railroad again, and went on for 2 more days. And by that time, I felt like that if I didn't get something to eat, I was going to die. So I was out following the railroad tracks, and I came to this crossing. And over in Germany, the people don't live on their farms. They live in little villages, and they go out and work on their farms, and they do it as a group. And so anyway, that day they were going to the woods and getting wood. And by the time the first wagon had finished, and it was coming back, and so I couldn't get across the road without them seeing me, so I just buried everything I had, and I decided I was going to go to that town where the wagons were going back to. And so I started walking, and I met a German farmer on a bicycle. And I tried to speak a little bit of German, and he spoke perfect English. And he told me, he says, I'll take you up to the first house, because over here the rule is that if a American prisoner comes up, they got to take you prisoner right there at that house. Well, he took me up this house, and a young woman came to the door, probably about 25 years old. And he started talking to her, and she slammed that door shut so fast, and there wasn't any way she was going to let me in her house. And I don't blame her, I wouldn't either. And he said, okay, he said, I just live not far down the road. I'll take you down there. I know you're hungry. And we'll fix you lunch, and then I'll take you down to the constable. And so that's what he did. He took me to his house. His family was very nice. And she liked my flying boots, so I gave them to her. And she gave me a really nice meal. And then he took me down to the constable, who looked like a general. He had medals all over him and everything. they sent in this guy from the Gestapo to question me, and he thought I had some important information, and I told him, I said, I was just a tail gunner, I don't know anything. And he tore the heels off my shoes, he made me undress and physically examined me, and finally, after 2 hours, he decided I really didn't know anything. And he left, and then under the Geneva Convention, if you were taken prisoner, you had to be taken prisoner by somebody of the same rank. I was a sergeant, and they sent a German Air Force sergeant in to take me prisoner. And by that time, everybody in the town knew that they had a prisoner. And so we started walking this German sergeant, the constable with me in the center. We started walking to the train station, and there was about 50 or 60 of these German youth corps that wore the short pants and the brown outfits, and they were outside and following us to the train station, and they were jeering and all this kind of stuff, and I thought, well, I don't know whether I'm going to make it to the train station. I only got these two guys, and there's 50 or 60 of them. But anyway, they didn't bother us. They'd cleared the station out, and we went there, and I waited for the train along with the sergeant. And we got on the train headed to Frankfurt, which was an interrogation center. And we hadn't gone probably 20 miles, and a P-47 came moving straight to the train, and we all jumped off, and I could have got away again because nobody paid any attention to me. But I'd already done that, and I'd eaten twice, and I was feeling pretty good. They hadn't killed me or anything. So I got back on the train and ended up in Frankfurt, in an interrogation center. They put me in a cell that had no windows, just wide enough for a cot. And we got, they would slide the meal in under a trap door they had at the bottom. And you only got 2 meals a day, and they weren't very much. But anyway, when I went in for the interrogation, it was a German colonel. And he said, Ralph, where you been? And I said, I've been out in the woods. And he said, we know that. He said, you're the last one of the crew because we found 2 parachutes that were still in the plane. And I said, I didn't say anything because we carried 2 extra parachutes, and I'd counted all the chutes, so I knew they all got out of the plane. And so anyway, he said, I know everything that I need to know. I'm going to tell you, and then if I say something wrong, I know what the rules are. You're only supposed to give me your name, rank, and serial number. You just tell me that I got it wrong. Well, he started out and he said, I know your father lives in Richmond, Missouri on a Hereford cattle farm, and I want to come down after the war and visit you. I said, well, if you do, you're going to win the war. Of course, I'm not going to invite you. And he just laughed. He didn't. The only thing he didn't know was that we had changed our commander at the base 2 days before we left, and he didn't have that information. But he knew everything else, and I didn't tell him any different. But I just listened. And from there, I went to a distribution center in Wetzlar, and from Wetzlar, I went to Nuremberg. And then at Nuremberg, on about the 4th of April, Patton was getting close, General Patton and his Third Army, and they marched us out 97 miles from Nuremberg to Mossberg, which is down by Munich. And then Patton actually caught up with us. And I just feel the greatest day of my life is the day that General Patton rolled into our camp and liberated me on April 29th of 45. And from that day on, I said, you know, I'll do everything I can for veterans and military. And that's what I've done.